back we are here for the next conference, presented to us by Dr. Patrick Fellus, who will tell us a little bit more about Froggymouth, all the way from Genesis to neuroscience, and helping us to understand basically better and more in depth how it actually works and operates marvels for you. That's the whole point of the following conference. So in order to briefly introduce you, the next speaker, Dr. Patrick Fellus is the titulary member of the National French Academy of Dental Surgery, but also founding member of the IFUNA International Functional National Association, of which we have already spoken a lot earlier today. He's also the founding president of the French Pediatric Orthodontic Society, as well as consulting practitioner from the Hôpitaux de Paris hospitals. And last but not least, also a judicial expert to the Paris Court of Justice. So this presentation should be beyond the simple biopic that I mentioned briefly. I would like to mention perhaps more anecdotal or personal story, which is, at the end of the day, the raison d'être of the organization of this Congress. In fact, it's the story of a young man pretty much impressed and in awe in front of his father's career and professional path, motivation, as well as the useful discoveries and inventions he made, because the student could not but help being flabbergasted by the far-reaching consequences of his father's discovery, and that turned around his whole vocation, as I said, as well as the motivation of this youngster to decide to take over his father's company. And this is, at the end of the day, nothing but the story of my father and myself. So this device that you're all familiar by now with, I suppose, as it has been distributed and circulated on more than 4 continents, has started a long time ago, Froggymouth, namely. It's a story that begins back in the 1970s when a young stomatologist has just graduated. And this stomatologist, who is already no one really among his peers, decides to specialize in stomatology and starts by saying, or admitting himself, that he could not have understood anything on the subject he decided or chose to specialize in later on without the help of his own masters. And that is why, moving from the hospital de Paris to the hospital Robert Debré, from one transdisciplinary unit to another, he was able to come across some really interesting disciplines, and Professor Delaire, who will be among them as a surgeon, dental surgeon, and all of this contributed to the observation skills of our professor, because they all taught him first and foremost how to better understand your patient by observing them closely and understanding what his intrinsic being consists in and how it conditions his modus operandi, basically, by trying to question your own paradigms all the time. And so this is one of the first articles I came across, which he had released in the 1970s, about the importance of the bilabial contact. And that was all before evolving and making much progress on this subject in order to better understand with his own teacher and master from Fez, because they both came to the conclusion that it was by preventing temporarily this bilabial contact that you could force the tooth or teeth rather occlusion in order to strengthen the watertight joints basically that you need in order to perfect and improve your swallowing technique. So by the 1980s, the concept of the froggy mouth that we've been talking about all day today was already in at its embryonic stage, so to speak. So we spoke a lot about passive and active approaches. All of these were gradually implemented by the first orthodontic expert who ventured to redress or correct his patient's behavioral attitude by trying to stabilize functionally his chewing or swallowing techniques instead of just putting on some metallic rings or trying to constrain the chin to lips and tongue relationship. So this is why the profession asked him to codify the set of new exercises he wanted to try out, basically, and convey to his peers. So the idea was to try first, well, one of the first exercises was try to grab this lower lip and try to block the lip, as well as trigger the saliving reflex by holding onto the slip. And that was an extremely active and conscious approach, of course, which was showing its results and its efficiency right from the beginning. But it definitely required a lot of time and strong and obvious cooperation with, of course, the patient. So in that respect, his cooperation demands could only happen or take place and deploy themselves provided the parents collaborated with the therapist, because answering basically the question whether the child did his exercises well or not did not really answer or suit the question in his opinion, for example. So instead of telling me whether your son or your child did his homework well, I'm asking you whether you made sure that he would do them well, because that's really what I'm focusing on, creating and setting the circumstances in order to optimize these changes. So by the end of the year 2000, during a consultation at the Robert Debré Hospital in the service and department he was in charge of, during one of those consultations, like any other, during which he was putting some braces like any orthodontist in the world, there always comes a time when suddenly you see things in a different light. But that is, at the end of the day, just the final drop, adding on to a piling process of multi-layers of experiences and reflections and questions. And just like for Newton, this is the very moment where you usually cry eureka. So this serendipity discovery enabled him to suddenly think of, while he was putting the braces on the teeth of his patients, which sometimes lasted about 40 minutes, he suddenly realized that the tongue had not once come out of its box during those 40 minutes of preparation. And then he didn't say to himself, this is not possible because he surely must have been swallowing his saliva. And this was without the patient even being aware of it or deploying the slightest effort, in fact, because the tongue just subconsciously, automatically places itself against the tooth and triggers this swallowing movement during and especially under some constraining circumstances which were artificially drawn and provoked by the posing of the braces. That is how the tongue forced itself to put itself in the proper swallowing position. And that temporarily artificially triggered reflex could somehow be exploited on a more consistent base. And that these were the premises basically of the starting reflection for Professor Fellus to imagine the principle that he had been discussing already with Professor Fez 30 years on. But then it was manufactured in such a way that the patient didn't even have to think about it. In the beginning, the first pilot model were not the most comfortable ones. The first definition looked a little bit like what you can see on your screen, and that is the reason why he tried to work on it as best as he could in order to improve and find the optimal opening width for efficiency without being too uncomfortable. Because the best tool or the most sophisticated technical device you have can only be useful when it is, as was already mentioned before, when it is properly used, when it is used by somebody who's motivated, who understands fully how the brain needs to operate in order to re-educate itself and stabilize its learning process in the long run. So bearing all of this in mind, he tried to expand a philosophy which would enable his patients as well as his technicians to really fully comprehend all of these determinants. And this approach, this new philosophical approach, was called the anoetic approach. And without further ado, I shall give the floor to this eminent professor, namely my father. Well, thank you so much, dear son, for having actually done my conference on my behalf. Thank you. That was a pleasure, really. I'll just fix your microphone so that you can, after I've stolen all these ideas of yours, validate and confirm them or explain them more exhaustively. Well, now, seriously, I will indeed try to explain to you how the neurosciences and the brain physiology enabled me to grasp how Froggymouth was supposed to operate. So, like any orthodontist, I was taught how to align teeth. So, in itself, that wasn't so difficult, but it wasn't fully satisfying for me in as much as applying and simply implementing a treatment onto whoever patient without explaining the cause, in my opinion, was always counterproductive in as much as you were running the risk of a relapse, and a relapse in the dental field can sometimes even lead to aggravation. So that led me to think, or to bounce on this sentence I quite like from Marguerite Yourcenar, finding the secret of stones implies understanding the secret of their sources. And instead of admitting simply that 50% of the children will always have to, at the stage of mankind's evolution, turn to orthodontic treatment, I tried to understand why 50% of them will never need it. And that comparative statistic can be paralleled with another survey that was carried out by the Social Security fund about 4-year-old children, and that led to the result that 60% of children have naturally acquired a dental swallowing pattern, and that is often concomitant with the establishment of medication which favors neurogenesis by increasing the secretion of neural growth factors and the salivating glands, and an increase in EGF in the parotid and submaxillary glands. But we need to come back to the origins and fully understand that the sucking and swallowing actions, in fact, develop already at the intrauterine stage during the brainstem development. And so at a time when the baby can swallow in a safe and secure environment where the temperature is absolutely isothermic, thanks after being expelled and in the wild open world, he will, thanks to this smell and to some facial muscle reflex, understand how to stabilize the mandible by contracting his facial muscles. The tongue will have to tuck itself between the alveolar ridges and then rest against the labial sphincter. That enables the saliva to be swallowed by a pressure difference between the anterior and posterior parts of the mouth, but that requires a properly tight seal that should be created by the junction of the lips. But it is worth remembering that about a third of adults still have a dysfunctional mode of swallowing. And although I didn't purport to re-educate the majority of the population, I wanted to at least make sure that their re-education would come at a sufficiently early point in time of their education in order to make it as successful as possible. In fact, It's around 4, as we say, that usually the swallowing and chewing process begin to be implemented. So praxis logically could only be, and modification thereof can only be useful from that age on, in theory. The objective being to modify the neurological commands and the control centers so that a new information can be conveyed to the brain, and if it is not a relevant one, it will be eliminated, in fact, and quickly ignored or forgotten. Whereas if it is relevant, it should normally trigger a reorganization and reshuffling of the neural circuits, and this by energetic means. So energetic is sounding very complicated or esoteric, but I did dwell upon it in a previous work of mine, and that explains and conveys the notion of the absence of nous or of consciousness is what I mean thereby. And what do I mean by the absence of consciousness? It is that the swallowing and mastication programs are involving a neurological, very slow neurological maturing process, the center of which is located in the frontal cortex of the brain, and whose command is controlled on the one hand by a geniculate bundle that depends on the pyramidal way, and on the other hand by the efficiency of the nerves of the cerebral trunk. So this happens and develops progressively until new synapses are naturally modified so as to create new information circuits during the mastication process, which then will be circulated bottom up to the neurosensitive areas. But in actual fact, we need to come back on some of those so-called praxis. Praxis can be defined as the possibility for a subject to coordinate a movement in order to give and convey some meaning to it, as well as determine its efficiency. So they're managed by neural circuits, which bundles of neurons connected at the level of synapses, and where electrical as well as biochemical processes will alternate all the way from the original neurons to the final destination, and this stopping over through a number of, could be hundreds or hundreds or thousands or even hundreds of millions of intermediate neurons. Kendall told us that learning consisted in tracing new circuits. Well, this plasticity can be done either by progressively reworking existing programs or by creating new ones. And after the stressing in passing an analogy that was also made by the previous speaker, Samantha, when you start using a specific path, it becomes much easier, of course, to automatically go down the mountainside, basically using the same ones that you're familiar with, rather than exploring new ones. And therefore, this Froggymouth device, by the muscular forces it generates, will promote an optimal growth of the jaws, hoping to become part of the 50% of the children who will never need an orthodontic treatment. And this happens naturally. Of course, there's a genetic predisposition, and many of these behaviors potentially change within the brain and are all programmed by sheer genetics. However, endogenous or innate factors only produce likelihoods, and they will actually be expressed only if the adequate exogenous conditions arise at the opportune time. So there are several important notions: exogenous, appropriate or adequate, and opportune or at the right time. And then Dawson Church, after Changeux, also states that genes are activated or disactivated by our beliefs, our emotions, and our attitudes. Consequently, epigenesis, by contrast with pure genetics, is a molecular mechanism that allows heritable changes in gene expression without altering the DNA sequence. And in my previous work, I try to explain, or I often give an example, in fact, to better explicit this comparison between genetics and epigenetics. I often say that genetics is, say, the score of the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven, but if you give the same score to 5 different orchestras, you will obviously get 5 very different performances. Now, Cooley has also noticed that the maintenance of the intake by sucking in the child maintained a certain delay in the setting up of the mastication praxis. 3 main causes can be found for that. One main one has to do with sucking and swallowing. Again, the fact that simply the child was never given the opportunity to discover this new mode of functioning. For example, if you're fed with compotes and milk and mincemeat and all sorts of nearly liquid or very soft ingredients, you're not really pushed towards acquiring a new type of sucking or swallowing. The other reason stems from his random discovery, in fact, that the limbic system can, for psychological reason also, omit, in fact, this new mastication program for lack of appetite, immaturity, or the comfort of sticking to your thumb and pacifiers or bottle food, because it enables an emotional link to the mother, for example. And then last but not least, the anatomical frame was not created in order to integrate the new program. And if it's really incompatible with the learning or the acquiring of a new type of swallowing because of some extremely huge gaps or dysmorphosis, physiological problems created by an excessive sucking, forcing the tongue to be very low, well, it is harder, obviously, to adjust. And the retromandibulitis cases or the likes where the mandibule is very much backward with respect to the upper one, obviously hamper the modification or the gradual adaptation of the praxis, and an orthopedic stage or helper will probably be necessary.
And there was something recurrent here, the necessity for something, a seal at the lips, and the seal is obtained during the activity of the facial nerve. You can see that the forced bilateral contact is obtained either by the elevation of the square of the chin or the contraction of the orbicular. But in any cases, it is the perioral musculature that will ensure the sealing. And therefore, the principle of our rehab technique is based on the disconnection of the tongue lift and the elevation of the lingual dome. These are not necessarily new things, because I have attended all the conferences today, and this has been tackled and developed also by other speakers today. But really, the modification of the bilabial contact will lead to a modification of the lingual posture and will therefore create a posterior seal for breathing that will inhibit the breathing of calm. And this double functionality is way too often forgotten by the rehab workers and this might be one of the cause of the failure in rehab. So Guillaume has already revealed things in explanation to remove these bilateral joint. I asked the child to hold his lip, swallow the saliva, and automatically the movement, the lip escaped from the fingers, and it will allow the child to realize that there's some activity in the swallowing movement. Once he perceives this necessity, this need to seal the lips, I'll ask him to get the lip, to spread the lip, hold the lip, and make sure that there is no movement of the lower lip, which means that it won't be sealed, and that the swallowing will happen. I also, because I realized that it was not enough to do it, I asked kids for 5 minutes to stand in front of a mirror and check if the lips were relaxed or, on the contrary, they were contracted. And so I was thinking of the inhibit facial activity and therefore allow trigeminal activation, which will facilitate dental occlusion, because we saw at first with newborns how the mandible is stabilized by the dental occlusion, which will bring the lingual dome closer, and just by this contraction, this will enable the swallowing. I'll show you now the first case that we use at the hospital, and in the final version of the Froggymouth, with a kid of 2.5 years old. He was coming out of intensive care because he was sick, and he had been sent by the neurological department, the neurology department, and Professor Evra. And well, let's see in the short video. I'm going to ask, unfortunately I haven't been listened to, that I would need you to not hide the eyes on this in this case, because there is this despair that is so significant, in the eyes, reflected in the eyes. And I actually was authorized to screen this case. So I saw this kid 2 weeks later. Classic speech therapist asking a child of 200 years old, deep, who absolutely does not control his movement. Well, let's see the change 2 weeks later. So you can see that he discovered the proper way to swallow. You can see the change, the physiognomy change, and the well-being that he felt when he discovered this new function. And his mother told me that the most difficult thing was to make him wear this only 15 minutes a day, because he felt so good wearing it that he would actually totally want to keep it all the time. There's another case too, it's the grandson of one of our colleagues who came and told me that his grandson always stick his tongue out. And well, honestly, I think there's nothing that I can do about this. And, we tried the Froggymouth, and immediately the tongue goes in. And 6 months later, well, you can see that the tongue still remains inside of the mouth, and the life of this kid totally changed, and the perception of the other people around him as well. But let's get back to the look of this previous kid that unfortunately we couldn't get to see, and how it really and I had been really struck by his stress. The study of neuroscience and everything made me understand that without knowing it, I had confirmed the work of Joris Viegas, who had proved that stress facilitates the mechanisms of the memory, but only when it is felt at the moment when the body must memorize the event, and only between when the hormones and the neurotransmitters activate the same networks, that those who are activated by learning. That's exactly what happened with the froggy. There was a stress that was caused at the time of learning of the new praxis. And this is Mike McIntyre. You can notice that a highly emotional state can bypass normal biochemical stresses and produce a sufficient amount of MAP molecules that will then be sent back to the nucleus, since we saw that it was at the level of the synapses and neurotransmitters that everything happens. But when there's a lot of stress and you want to go through long-term memory, you have to touch the nuclear and the molecule, and in order to facilitate these long-term memory reflex. And we have been realizing that if 20 years ago you went through a car crash, with you remember without needing to have to repeat it, that it happened at Christmas Eve, that you were with your husband and your children, that there was light, that you were going to dinner for New Year's Eve, and that you were wearing this blue dress and the matching blue coat, and you did not repeat that the week after the accident, which means that the production of amyloids will be printed in the long term. Will definitely print in the long-term memory. And you could say the same thing about your wedding ceremony, that you'll remember for a lifetime, either being a good or bad memory. The Froggymouth is a device that is worn 15 minutes a day for a fairly short period of time in front of a television screen, because therefore it was recorded and recognized by the nervous system, and that gives the possibility to discover a new mode of swallowing in a non-conscious way, anoetic. And the major indeed, for the child, it is impossible to ensure the seal at the labial level, which is essential to the progress of the motor program of the swallowing section. Hence, the immediate brutal reaction at the level of the brain, finding a new program. And therefore, you can notice that the child was facing a contradiction, an impossibility, forcing him to question and reorganize his previous knowledge, his previous naive or incomplete knowledge. And you've seen that with the program, you inhibit the facial nerve, you stimulate the trigeminal, which will allow you to obtain dental occlusion. If there is a dental occlusion, the posterior part of the tongue will come closer to the palate, and will be and there will be just a little movement, a small contraction, to be able to swallow saliva in a physiological way. So I think through the activation of the emotional system and through that stress, which therefore opens up a new mode of immediate recording in long-term memory, in which researchers call that is to say, printing in memory the current content of a neuronal activity. And this new program is going to integrate immediately with procedural implicit to any previous learning. This is all stored in the cerebellum, striatum, and amygdala. But the important thing and mandatory thing is to overcome this obsession to modify and he would be able to breathe, and then he would be forced to lower his tongue, and then it comes back into a vicious circle that will get worse. Here again, we can clearly see that we have to pay attention to the physiognomy of the nostrils, and we can clearly see in these previous cases that nostrils are absolutely not functional. And Takisho Ono, which explains that the tongue is a respiratory organ, which is therefore concerned with the respiratory circuits. And it even goes much further, since it integrates it into its neural circuits. I often hear contradictors saying that slightly open lips will facilitate nasal breathing, and that the lips must be necessarily close to in order to swallow. So I'm going to start again to sort of a paragraph of the master of breathing in France, telling us that when breathing nasal, the orofacial musculature does not intervene. So no participation of the facial nerve. The lips are in contact, but without construction of the binocular. And many children have incompetences, that is to say, an absence of bilabial contact, but who will not be respirators for the and whenever you need to close your lips in order to breathe, well, this is not following the natural physiological path. And speaking about the facial nerve, well, it's there to stimulate the trigeminal that controls the center of breathing and needs to amplify the nasal breathing. So lip incompetence is absolutely not an obstacle, but on the contrary, the key of our strategy. And I think Samantha, in an analytic way, did her whole talk with a t-shirt where you could see a beautiful smile with beautiful lipstick, and the top lip and the bottom lip that were very far away. So do not confuse contracted lips with lips and relaxed lips. So you would wear the Froggymouth for 15 minutes a day in front of the TV, and it's not restrictive, and above all, it does not interfere on the quality of sleep, which is fundamental, because the sleep promotes the consolidation of memory traces in the procedural memory, and in particular when learning motor sequences. That's the functional MRI that showed us that at night the brain relived all experiences that he had gone through, and that it was the same neural activity that occurred during the learning. And it's the same thing for school learning. It is important to sleep well, and this is why I'm totally opposed to having a device worn 14 hours a day. So 2 hours, well, a day, why not? But having them wear 12 hours and an oral device, I mean, for a child, this is something that is not physiological and not respectful, and we do not learn at night. So let's make things easy for the rehab of children and let them sleep peacefully. So is that enough? Marie-Yvonne Fournier has perfectly understood the issue, and she tells us that it is clear that neuromuscular labial functional rehab often recur frequently, and that I've always explained. I mean, she's talking about recidivism, but is that really one? The learning processes by way of top-down. But what that really means is that the Marie-Yvonne Fournier would presuppose that there would have been a cure, and however, there is an order that is carried out on demand, but the automation hasn't been obtained, and that is why she also says that we're never careful enough to check if automation have been obtained. And this is why I liked when Vanessa Choureau talks about habits and automatisms, and that it's also why it needs to have to be submitted to a follow-up. She actually tells him that on the contrary, it is a question of obtaining and the create an automatism, therefore a praxis without conscious that we could totally call anoethic, and that is that proves that we have only been exploring the first step in a strategy of change of practice. It will have to pay a lot of attention to the automation of these functions through the control of the therapist, who can be transferred to the parents. And there again, neuroscience shows here that if learnings have stimulated several brain's area and therefore created several neural circuits, the activation of one of them would have the effect of activating the others. We are dealing with a connectionism system, and what we talked about neural circuits, and it's estimated to be over 100 billion, and each neuron establishes 10 millions of connections. This is a lot of information that cannot be saved and automated, but there is a possibility to eliminate until the adult all synapses that are useless or redundant in the neural circuits, and along with the time, they get sharpened and refined according to their use. The other circuits that I have mentioned, the fascial praxis, are therefore concerned by this connectionism, and its role is precisely is assigned to glial cells, and their role is very important for in learning. So we've seen that the praxic program was controlled by neurons, which means that there are messages go through well, the neurotransmitter that will transmit the information to all neural circuits, which has a consequence on the lips control, which is interesting in terms of understanding how the tongue works and the anoetic process of these rehab in order to improve the efficiency of those. This is what we call the crosstalk. And so these glial cells control the timing, the location, and the plasticity of synapses. These are brand new works that have just been published. So what happens? Samantha also picked up on this. We can consider that the first piece that needs to be considered is the first domain, that is the neural circuits that manages to the lips, the position. It will modify the posture of the tongue with a top-down perspective, but you can go a step further. It can cover the palate, the musculatures of the inner ear, the soft palate, to open and eradicate the causes of ear infection. Then this is almost impossible to carry out by a top-down approach. So you're going to have a global modification of all circuits anoetically, and the only thing is that we'll need to pay a lot of attention on the other praxis that you want to have control over. It's not easy for the child to breathe through the nose because he's not aware of the path of the air through the nose. And so this is how we decided to go through scent or perfumes recognition exercises. That is to say, through smell circuits and olfactory bulb and the circuits of nasal breathing, and all these extensions that are going to allow automation much faster. So how do you promote this automation, since we saw it was ultimately the most difficult thing, and when we learned there was a new swallowing program, it's just like buying a new program for your computer. You had an old program, I suck my saliva, and then you downloaded the new program. I swallow my saliva, and you'll have two different icons on your computer, which means that you'll have to go and click on the program that is going to run. And clicking the icon will trigger the old program. That is, my lips are twitched and my teeth do not touch each other. The icon will call the right program. Is my and my teeth are going to be tied, my lips will be relaxed, and all of this thanks to the trigeminal activation. And therefore, there's been some interesting works at the UCLA University where they decided to work on this learning approach, which is about repeating. And at the end of the day, well, there's an evaluation, and that's often how we found ourselves with automation that is not quite satisfactory. So a second program is there, well, to end up with a new learning process and then run tests, followed by an evaluation. And well, most people would think that this is the first program that is the most effective, but it's actually the fourth one. And dozens of scientific publications have showed the effectiveness of what is called the retrorate practice, and which is one of the most effective teaching strategies. And moreover, well, dozens of publications demonstrate its effectiveness, and this fourth strategy will be tackled on for programs that are managed by AI, because it is usually at the end of the game that we actually find out if we won or lost. And the idea is to act and also be self-evaluated. And if you see that the self-evaluation is not satisfactory, then it's worth amending the program. Well, initially, the predictioner recommends it, but it can also be done by the parents, and then the whole program will unfold in an analytic way. These sequence will be controlled at the by the alpha motor neurons, and will be controlled at the level of the cerebellum, which detects and corrects the difference between the movement executed and the desired movement, and who will therefore restore things thanks to the ganglia of the base, which in addition will remove erroneous data. And it's a bit of this, it's similar to the information that has been recorded. You'll need to make some adjustments, and make all circuits inoperative, and to give the circuits all their efficiency. So from a neurotransmitter point of view, it is known that the correct circuits have been straightened unconsciously by the release of toponym. So here it is, for example, and this is why it's not too complicated. This is an image with practicing parents, and parents should keep that in the back of their mind. And there's the pupil is tight, the square, and they forget the chin, and it's contracted, and it's not good. Now you can see that the lips are totally swallowed, while good posture is precisely the relaxed, with the relaxed lips. It's just a little thread between the fine line between the top lip and the bottom lip. And well, every day you'd hear the parents say, "Oh, this is good, this is not good, this is right, this is not right. No need to be behind him. 3 times is enough." And then the whole system was going to automate through the activity of the brainstem and the cerebellum. There's another aesthetic criteria. Also, we see when the tongue falls in the lower jaw, we have the feeling that there's, this young girl has a double chin, and while this synoglossus activates to automatically raise the back of the tongue and completely change its profile. When the tongue is not in the right position, you'll see that the lips are affected, and you see how relaxed the lips can get when you follow the protocol. We also talked about the phonation. I mean, we've said that it's too limited in time, that it's an influence, but, well, an in-depth study has shown that the coexistence of suction, that mastication and spoken language seem to demonstrate the intricacies between verbal and food or oralities. And this correlation between verbal and food orality is further reinforced by the fact that the same anatomical pathways are used, but they are used in the opposite direction. And that's so you should not lose interest in speech. There is a very simple test that allows you to judge if the rehab is effective. It is asking if you see the tongue coming out in the background. If you can see the tongue out, you see in the back, that means that it hasn't been rehabbed, because if the sounds are made by the lips at this point, while swallowing, it can be handled by the tongue. And on the other hand, if the phrase is supported by the tongue, well, at the time of the tongue would have to come in, then you would have to see the tongue coming in and then out again. I mean, it's way too complicated and way too uncomfortable, and it's much more comfortable to keep the swallow suction. So it is very important that the sounds are made by the lips and the tongue, that you can work and on swallowing, and that either sounds are made by the tongue. That's what we call talking baby when we talk about this. So again, how do you realize and let the child understand, if we face this case study, that you see that the tongue is sticking behind all the time? I ask the child to grit his teeth and count from 1 to 1 while he have them closed. So that's the only way to modulate the sounds. It's not an easy exercise. You can do that for like 7-8 days maximum. And the second week, well, you will have the possibility to improve this. You will go through the same exercise about once a day. And of course, you realize that it's not normal to talk with your lips sealed. But you need to hear the clap 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you'll go faster by counting. So the more the faster you go, then it will make that tongue stick in and allow the shaping of sounds. Well, we could talk about a clinic case that was carried out by the Dr. Carnet in the University of Lille that would took 4 parameters to know precisely and to evaluate the effectiveness of this. So it's a study that was carried out on a duration of 10 weeks. And at the beginning, we were looking a little bit for the labial chin contraction, and after 90% after 5 weeks, it's like 32%, and after 10 weeks, it only exists in 15% of the patients. So first stage, this is how the automation is processed. You can see that after a few weeks, most of the kids are totally cured, and we can still observe 20% of failure.
And so the results vary. For some people, the results are clearly decipherable after 10 weeks. Some others go faster, but you should never fall into despair, and the repetition of exercises can, of course, increase the percentage of success. Now, tongue thrust. This, again, needs to distinguish between the absence of tongue thrusting, the anterior, lateral, or total interposition of the tongue, and also you can see the extremely significant results of the use of Froggymouth. And the last here parameter being the arches occlusion, which is, of course, absolutely necessary for the tongue to push itself and find its support on some sufficiently stable mandibules. And you can see the percentage at the end of the time period considered raising all the way up to 82%. So on the whole, it can be said that 60 to 70% of the rehabilitation process that is perfectly successful, and 15 to 20% which is requiring a little more motivation. In fact, thanks to Marc Pelle, I was able to discover Fabius Coppa's work in Rome 2 or 3 years ago. And I worked recently, I came across recently a study he released concerning the motor sensor stimulation when endorsing some of these functionalizing programs. And this article shares a brand new element of information concerning the tongue posture, thanks to the discovery of 5 new extra receptors positioned on the palate, which connect the nasal palatal region to the brain under some specific physiological conditions. So the tongue, during deglutition, touches the palate behind this incisal papilla, and this so-called tiger point, in fact, or zone or spot, in fact, is the one that enables the automation of the good lingual posture. And in fact, this is a natural relay, or trigger, if you will, between the palatal receptors and the cerebral cortex. This, in fact, fully corroborates a study that I had also released, because I'm also convinced that the Froggymouth doesn't act on the same zones as the suction swallowing phenomenon. So it doesn't stimulate exactly the same zones. And in fact, a young 7-year-old girl who accepted here at Necker Hospital to undergo magnetic resonance here was, as you see, photographed during a stage of total rest with no specific activity in the oral zone. And then when she's asked to activates some sort of swallowing process. You see a red point lighting up, and when the Froggymouth is inserted in the booth of her magnetic resonance for the first time, she clenches her teeth, and you can see automatically an increase of the concerned zone around the levels of the swallowing receptors, or cerebral zones rather. And this discovery was also corroborated by Marine Ponce in the Brussels hospital on a different case, this one based on a 35-year-old adult who was suffering a sort of deep or open bite, basically, and you can see that the use of the Froggymouth passed into the machine activates automatically the lateral zone. So, but the difference here is that a month later, with or without the Froggymouth, you can see the same zones being stimulated equally. So that shows how permanently the behavior and the program of swallowing in this person's brain was affected and changed. Now, I think I would like here to make parallel, draw an analogy with the Rubik Cube, because I was always very fascinated by this game, and even though I'm not a very manual person, I do my best, and at the end of the day, succeed with a bit of luck to create one side of it harmoniously and monochrome as required, but then as soon as I try to generate a second monochrome side of the cube, I run into trouble because, as most people who are not clever enough, the creation requires passing through a certain amount of destruction, which not everyone can go beyond. Whereas my son, you will discover in less than a minute, is able to quite simply and straightforwardly produce those 6 sides of the cubes. And that is what brought me to coining the phrase or the term simplexity, because complexity, if I may describe it so, could characterize a system which is composed of a great number of elements, so all interacting with one another without a central coordination, without a central architect or central brain orchestrating them and leading therefore to a spontaneous emergence of a complex structure. This is a definition given to us by Alain Barra, whereas a simplex phenomenon is a complex thing that you have destroyed the complexity of which and which you are able to explain simply or straightforwardly. Well, thank you so much for your conference. Yeah, the first question that was asked to us in the chat that I will seize upon is, how can you guarantee the automation of the praxis? Well, by prescribing 3 times a day, about 15 minutes use of it, and look at me, this miracle in the meantime. Praise the sun. Isn't that remarkable and awe-inspiring? It always makes me sweat, literally, to see. First of all, because it's too hot under the limelight here, and also because I'm so proud of my son. So, back to the questions. Yes, automation, you were saying, how can you provide the best possible guarantee to parents that it will work? And the second question underlying the first one is, what is the parents' role apart from looking on to what their children are doing 3 times a day? What apart from this framing role of making sure that you use your program at the right time, at the right frequency? The second stage is indeed going past this first constraining disciplinary checkup or control, making sure that this automation phase is really gradually walked into, and that means simply not only controlling that it is well performed, but sufficiently regularly, and then watching or observing how relaxed the lips can be, for example, around the wearing and of this Froggymouth, for example. So as we explained, it should be both relaxed and closed, and that is an indicator of the tongue being in good posture, which means that normally the breathing will also be coming out properly as it should. So all these external signs are part of a virtuous cycle. They can also be vicious, of course. And what is interesting is that with all these re-education systems, everyone can try to intervene wherever they choose to. My input or my point of intervention is at the level of the lips, but other orthophonists may want to, or orthodontic experts rather, sorry, may choose to concentrate on the swallowing or on the breathing process. And in fact, everyone gets a foot in the door basically somewhere, decides to observe more closely how connections operate from that point in the cycle, and make sure that from this benchmark or this reference point, all the behavioral changes desired materialize. So basically what you choose to modify in the first place is lips, not so much because it is in itself a decisive factor to have lips positioned a certain way, but because you realized the interaction between the tongue's position and its influence on the swallowing and on the mastication. Yeah, exactly. So it's like a sequence, a motor sequence, basically. If the first step or the first element is not properly emulated, obviously you can very quickly be led into a dead end. So that's the reason why I picked on the lips, because I believe it's the most transparent and accessible entry point for the child as well as the therapeutic and the parents. Again, another question here, perhaps. In as much as you were the first sort of orthophonic orthodontist specialist who decided to bring in all these elements. So what brought you to develop this connection if you hadn't had this epiphany, basically? What got you to that realization, you believe? Well, when I arrived at the Bretonneux Hospital and I observed some 1 centimeter wide, deep or open bites, and that I saw some of the clinicians being basically satisfied with just observing those open critical stages without really devising a specific strategy to remedy it. Well, I thought it was a real shame, basically, and saddening not to try to act and remedy those, because in 2 to 3 months you could see some dramatic results. Just simply by resorting to a few proactive exercises as mentioned before. And the beauty about the Froggymouth, of course, was that you could even achieve those results without imposing those specific exercises. So how did you start to work on the optimization of the proper tension, or the openness and the width of the device once you had come up with that idea? Well, that was achieved by asking the child to self-monitor himself in a mirror, in fact. So you were giving him a mirror basically to the child and asking him to say how comfortable he felt? Yes, the premises of our strategy anyway, that in the meantime has been validated by our neuroscience knowledge or articles exposed, but potentially and algorithmically, everything was there from the outset ingrained, basically. And that's often the way I work. When I know I want to write on a subject or write an article, I know that this is at the back of my mind somewhere. And as I drive a lot, for example, because I live in the outskirts of Paris and work in Paris, so I tend to not put any interfering noise or music on. I drive in silence. And then when I arrive at my office, all of a sudden, without suffering from the page block panic attack, basically, I know that in 2 articles, the article will be unfolding itself quite naturally. It was again conceived in an anoyetic way. I didn't really have to consciously repeat any or rehearse any specific thread of thoughts. The original primitive idea or concept was there, and once the conception is there in germs, if you like, it unfolds in its own time. So it's not so much ensuing from a cortical process as from the unconscious anoyetic course of events. So again, so you were talking about the Hospital de Bray, and I can see a number of people actually waving to you because you apparently contributed to develop some of their stomatology courses, and in 1992 he attended an internship at your hospital, and he kept a very fond souvenir of how inspiring his stay with you was there. So another interesting point I just wanted to ask you perhaps is the degree of openness of the lips precisely around that device. How can you move all of a sudden from first series of article on the importance of the bilabial contact and then to the conclusion that the contact, the sheer bilabial contact, is not really the relevant or most important point, but it's all the engineering that is behind it? Well, thank you. In fact, to be honest, drafting an article of any sort is extremely compromising because obviously written acts and are deeds that stay, contrary to words that fly away. And so very often in the scientific community, when you have to think twice before writing anything down, because a few years later you may turn your conclusions or your point of view around. Well, that's why, in a way, it was a sort of relief, because going back to that article, I must say that I proofread what I wrote about this bilabial contact, and there was a mention of without excessive pressure already in my first draft. So that's what saved me slightly from total utter inconsistency or contradiction, although it is not inconsistent, in fact, over time to change one's position in one's mind, of course. But I'm only joking, but in this specific case, it is a fine balance, in fact, between the proper tension, basically, of the bilabial contact and yet the mandibules toning up process. And there was that reminds me of a symptom of asphyxia where there were major losses in the respiratory process, and once he was encouraged to work on this bilabial contact, things were sorted for him, because that would again stop this glossoptose, which is, after all, the stumbling block basically of functional orthodontics, because orthodontics actually was started in the United States in the after-war, post-war years, but Pierre Robin, for example, worked both in France and in the United States, and already then the treatments preferred were functional orthopedic treatments. Yes, I guess you've referred to the American and French school, but in fact the whole European school turned to this functional trend, even though not everyone had the means to enact this theory. Yes, that's correct. So the consciousness was there, the awareness was there pretty much from the outstart, but even though some things were intuitively felt or understood, we didn't have all the neuroscience explanations backing it up by then. And I suppose one certain fact on which everyone usually agrees is the importance of breathing through the nose. And how did you come to expand on that aspect of things? Well, Chandre told us a lot about the narcoleptics effects. In fact, even though it was not his specialty, in fact, to study sleep-related disease, I don't want to be defloring his work, because I know that we have more conferences to come on the insomnia or sleeping disorders, but I think it's important to say that the rehabilitation of this breathing or nose breathing is connected to the anterior-posterior proper joining of the jaws, and that is mentioned, I believe, in the preface of a book entitled From Dysfunction to Dysmorphosis, a book about orthopedics that I did backwards, if you like, by studying the dysfunctions and their consequence on the etiology, consequences of the dysmorphosis, instead of starting from the dysmorphosis and trying to understand which dysfunctions they may be related to. So, to sum it up, that book was also responsible partly for opening up your horizon to some alternative views, although it was already the case, if I understand you well, with your Prague colleague. And in fact, yes, all started from your realization that it mattered to ask oneself why things went well among the sample of children who were not going to have some orthodontic treatment. Yes, truly. When we come up with the statistics of saying 50% of the children will be needing some orthodontic treatment, it is only the half-empty side of the glass. And I recall visiting or attending a concert by the Petits Enfants de la Croix de Bois, who are orphans mainly. And I realized that from the moment you had a good elocution and a good breathing education, could you count the statistics basically. And on those about 50 patients I visited at the Croix de Bois choir, I realized that only 8 of them, so a much smaller statistic basically than this generic one, were suffering from potential orthodontic conditions. So that kind of corroborated my intuition that when you could emulate some virtuous behaviors, the natural evolution basically would take care of the rest and put you on the right virtuous rather than a vicious cycle. So yes, that makes me think that what might be slightly mysterious about this Froggymouth discovery is that a long time, at ages ago, I would say, even all sorts of techniques had been tried out in terms of labial posture. And what generated the idea of the froggy mouth in your mind? Was that you suddenly cast a different eye basically on a situation that all worldwide orthodontists had already observed or testified of? Yes, well, these questions of inspiration, of course, are endless subject of debate. And I think it's also a matter of aesthetics, perhaps. The ideal drawing or sketching of this engine that would contribute to preventing the labial contact while respecting our prior knowledge on the whole mechanics behind it and protecting the lips from touching one another on a lateral basis as well. All of this required the intervention of a fine conceptual treatment as well as realization, and it just took the time it did to mature its course and come to terms, so to speak. Well, if you wish to have some stunning and amazing results, as you know, you can multiply, of course, the prescription that is usually associated with the use of Froggymouth, but overall, you know that the results are unavoidably there, have been produced and have been backed by scientific evidence. And for the rest, now I leave it all to you, my dear son. The rest of it is indeed rather more your job than mine. And I must say that I was quite impressed by your Rubik's Cube aptitude already. So I must say that I didn't know what would become of you, but I am pretty reassured and convinced, even though I didn't see much of you during part of my training. Thank you so much for setting up and organizing this seminar so remarkably well. And thanks also to the participants, of course, who played the game and who attended the conferences or who will do so in the future. As well as the interpretation team, for as much as we can hear, because Guillaume was unfortunately not talking in the microphone he bequeathed his father anymore. But thank you very much. for your attention.